Hey there, and welcome to the Hour of History podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman. With me this week is Rick Bell, who has just published a new book, Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home. It's out this week, October 2019, published by Simon Schuster, and it tells a compelling story that you'll hear Rick talk about in this podcast. We have tons of suggestions for you in the episode, and as always, they're at hourofhistory.com in text, so you can get some of those names, follow up on this, and read Stolen. It's a fascinating new book, and you're going to love it. I know I enjoyed the conversation, and I love to hear from you. If you have any suggestions, head over to hourofhistory.com and send us a note. We love to hear what you think. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy!
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast. Our world.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, links, and more, be sure to visit our website at www.hourofhistory.com. And for all the book recommendations made during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello, and welcome to the Hour of History podcast. It's good to have you, Rick.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, your new book that's just released, Stolen, about 5 free boys kidnapped into slavery and their sort of Odyssey home. It sounds absolutely fascinating. Before we jump into that, could you tell us a little bit about your background as a historian and what got you to this tantalizing topic?
Oh, sure. Okay, let's see if I give you the long version or the short version. So I grew up in England, as I bet your listeners have already figured out, even from a couple of sentence fragments. And I got turned on to history very late, in like 10th grade, because of a great high school teacher I had who turned me on to studying in general. I was a terrible student back in high school until a good teacher turned that around. I became interested in American history pretty belatedly because, as you might imagine, in Britain and maybe the rest of Europe, American history is not a central focus of undergraduate study. I think there's probably a sense on some level that nothing very important ever happened in American history by comparison to European history or British history, or that there isn't much history there at all. And if I ever thought that I was certainly put in my place by a college professor who did teach American history to a small but very loyal following of undergraduates at my undergraduate institution, and made a zealous convert out of me to the subject of American history. And then in graduate school, I had the great privilege of working with Laurel Ulrich, the author of Midwife's Tale, and she made sure that I became as enamored with social history and cultural history and the history of ordinary life and ordinary people as I know she is. So my journey towards this particular story, it's a really dark story. As you know, it's a story about the kidnapping of 5 free boys from the streets of Philadelphia in 1825 by a fearsome gang of kidnappers who intend to sell these boys as slaves in the Cotton Kingdom in Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, those sorts of areas. I came to this story because my prior book was about suicide. It was a study based on my dissertation of the cultural significance of suicide in America between the Revolution and the Civil War. And one day, as I was putting that project to bed, I think it was 2011 or somewhere around there, I came across a newspaper report in, I think it was a Baltimore or Philadelphia area paper, I can't remember, from 1829, describing the alleged suicide of a woman out on the eastern shore. Actually, she was in Delaware, across the Maryland line in Delaware, and who was in jail, in a local jail, a county jail, awaiting a trial for murder. For the murder of some black children and potentially of a slave trader. This woman's name was Patty Cannon, and I'd never heard of her before. And as I started to dig into her story, I realized that whether she had committed suicide in jail or died of old age or other complications was the least interesting and affecting part of her story, because she built a career over decades, it turned out, in human trafficking, in the illegal criminal kidnapping and enslaving of free Black people, many of them children, into slavery. And so I decided to follow myself down a research rabbit hole, learn as much as I could about this particular individual, and that project morphed into the book we have now, which is a micro history of one particular kidnapping case that she was one of the gang leaders responsible for. She's a relatively minor character in the book I've written, but she was my point of entry into the larger world of kidnapping of free Black people into slavery.
It's always interesting to hear how these stories develop, and certainly we should get more into this and the sources and how you see these kind of like breathtaking material that you use for the book. But before we get into that, you've changed your audience a little bit. You've written 2 academic books, and now this book, by all means, seems like it's going to be read far and wide. It's very accessible. You can pick it up and get lost in it in just a second. Not that other academic books aren't, but could you just address that for a second?
Oh, sure. Yes. I mean, you're absolutely right that this is what we call a trade book, which means that it has a very different publisher from the publisher of my first book, the suicide book I described earlier on. That was a Harvard University Press academic book. It was a traditional grad student tries to turn their dissertation into academic book to try and get tenure and keep his job sort of book. So it was argument-driven, ideas-driven, and aimed at, to be honest, graduate students and faculty, and not much else. And if you saw the sales record of that first book, you would see that it was successful in not reaching anyone else. This new book is published by Simon and Schuster, a New York trade publisher, one of the big 5. And I think definitely they hope, and I certainly hope too, that this book, this story, these characters, these lessons from American history will reach a much wider audience, whether that be undergraduates or first-year book programs or just general readers who are interested in history. It's been really interesting to see how in this first week of publication, the book and the story has been picked up by national news outlets like the Wall Street Journal and NPR and the New Republic. And hopefully that's a sign that this story and these characters can find that wider audience. But in terms of how this happened, I, like many historians, have always hoped to reach as large an audience as possible. And this was the research project, and it might be the only research project in my professional life, which I think will allow me to do that most effectively. The book that's emerged is a story. It is character-driven. It is narrative and event-driven. It has a beginning and a middle and an end. It certainly has characters I care about, and I hope that readers care about them too. This is a child-centered history of enslavement, where 5 boys, whose names are Sam, Enos, Alex, Joe, and Cornelius, are the protagonists. They sit at the center of this narrative, and an extraordinary range of events unfold as a result. So if I was ever going to write a trade book, this is the project which would lend itself to that. But it's not to say that this hasn't been without huge challenges. When you go through a doctoral program, when you go to graduate school to learn how to be an historian, to some extent they can teach you how to write dissertations, how to write analysis-driven, idea-driven pieces of original research and synthesis. They can teach you to write for graduate students. They can teach you to write for other faculty. But I don't ever once remember being taught how to reach and write for general readers. So this has been a very daunting writing challenge, really, to present my research in a way which is compelling for people who don't read academic history every day, who have other concerns and other cares. And so one of the things I worked hard to do is read a lot of really good popular and trade history, which has broken through with larger audiences, and then try to reverse engineer what was so great, so transcendent about some of that those works here, right?
Mm-hmm. And
That's wonderful.
yeah, thanks for addressing that. I think what's neat about it is kind of what you've already addressed. You have these 5 different stories, and each one kind of has its own unique twist that might grab someone's attention. I know this idea even of escaping from the north to the south to become free from New Jersey to Pennsylvania might be new to people. Maybe you could share one of the compelling stories of these boys and how you found it.
Yeah, so certainly, all these 5 boys have slightly different stories. 4 of the boys are freeborn members of the free black community in Philadelphia, a large and dynamic free black community. And we're in the 1820s, by the way, 1825. The 5th boy comes from a different background. He's the one you alluded to in your question. His name is Sam Scomp, and he was born a slave on a small New Jersey plantation in the northwest corner of New Jersey in Hunterdon County. And he escapes from his slave owner for lots of reasons, some of them obvious, one of which is that he's anticipating being sold to a new owner and doesn't want to take that risk. And when you escape from slavery in New Jersey, there's the question of where do you go? New Jersey was really one of the only surviving northern states where slavery existed in any significant numbers, and that too was under considerable legal and demographic threat by the 1820s. So for Sam, he runs south. Again, we think of people running north into Canada, don't we? But Sam runs south because 50 miles or so south of him is the great city of Philadelphia, one of the largest cities in the United States, home to one of the largest, if not the largest, free black community. He's probably been there a couple of times with his former master to deliver produce and other things, and may have some sense of that community of refuge. And that's what he's seeking. He's seeking refuge. He's seeking shelter. He's seeking protection and the possibilities to start over again in anonymity, or somewhere where his master can't or won't try to find him. So Sam arrives in Philadelphia in late July or early August 1825, and he knows no one there. He hopes to make friends and be taken in, but he actually spends the first 7 days, as far as we know, sleeping rough on the streets in downtown Philadelphia, looking for odd jobs, probably begging for food to some degree. And he's 15 years old. I should have said that to start with. He's 15 years old. And on the 7th day, when he is angling for work down by the docks, offering to help any arriving ship unload some of its cargo onto wagons and cart it into town, which is very common for dock workers, someone comes up to him and says, "Yeah, I've got a job for you. I've got a few crates of peaches and watermelons in a ship just half a mile away down by the old Navy Yard. If you come over with me to that ship, come aboard my ship, get these crates, you can borrow my wagon. I'd like you to drag them to the market. I can give you 25 cents. And 25 cents then is worth several meals. And Sam is hungry. So, of course, he follows this guy who says his name is John Smith down to the Navy Yard, about a mile out of town from Philadelphia. And when he gets on that ship, it becomes very evident immediately that John Smith is not who he said he was, and that he has lured this boy, this 15-year-old black child, this runaway slave who knows no one, onto this ship so he can abduct him. He forces him into the cargo hold. He chains him up. He ties him up. And one of his accomplices threatens the boy with a knife, puts a knife to his throat and says something along the lines of, if you holler, if you scream, I will cut your throat. And this is how Sam becomes one of 5 boys to find themselves in the cargo hold of this particular ship bobbing on the side of the Delaware River in August 1825, and that ship will soon set sail, and an entirely different future awaits than the one Sam imagined for himself when he ran south towards Philadelphia a week before.
And you address this in the book, certainly, but for listeners, they're probably wondering, but wait a second, I thought Philadelphia was this free sort of utopian society where, where black and white were free alike. How could such a thing happen? Where were the police? Who was doing this kidnapping?
So yeah, lots of issues there to untangle, and I've said repeatedly already that Philadelphia is home to a large and dynamic free black community, that if you want to live free as an African American within the United States, Philadelphia is one of your best bets, but that doesn't mean it's a good bet. It is one thing to be legally free and living as a black person in Philadelphia. It's another thing entirely to be free of discrimination, to be free of racist prejudice. It's one thing to be legally free. It's another thing to be able to get a job. It's one thing to be legally free. It's another thing to be able to find somewhere to live at a rate you can afford. It's one thing to be free. It's another thing to be able to find a spot in a school for your child. And the white population of Philadelphia, despite the progress made in that state to establish Pennsylvania as free soil, as a result of a gradual abolition law, a gradual anti-slavery abolition law that went into effect in 1780, and despite the fact that the city of Philadelphia is home to the largest and most dynamic anti-slavery group at the time, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, despite these facts, Philadelphia is a deeply racially segregated city with a white population who are not the automatic allies of the free black population living among them. They compete with this population for jobs, for spots in school, for housing and neighborhood resources. And as the free black population of Philadelphia discovers, that leaves them tremendously vulnerable when professional kidnappers, usually from out of state, usually from Delaware or Maryland or somewhere else, come into Philadelphia on what you might call sort of hunting trips, raiding trips, looking for vulnerable free black people, sometimes adults, usually children, who they can lure away or physically overpower and drag away. The chances of a white person witnessing that and doing something to stop it, the second part of that sentence especially, are pretty low, even 1825. So free black people walk around feeling like they have targets on their backs and prices on their head.
And this is also part of a sort of global story too. What is it that makes the sort of market, that makes this an attractive endeavor for a kidnapper to go and steal a human being?
Right, so it's a really important question. What's the macro context of this story, which takes place in 1825? Obviously, kidnappers kidnap people not to hold them hostage and ransom them back to their parents, but instead to transport them into the legal supply chain, to disguise them as legally purchased slaves and try to sell them to white Southerners who are in the market to buy slaves. So the context here is two things. Number one is the westward expansion and southern expansion of the United States after 1776. Over the next 50 years or so, with the Louisiana Purchase, the annexation of Florida, and various Indian removal schemes in the South, the agricultural acreage of the southern and western United States expands exponentially. We see one new territory after another. Each one becomes a state over time, whether that be, Kentucky, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, you name it. And as white settlers move into those new territories and states, a great many of them decide to set up as cash crop cultivators, cultivating sugar around Louisiana and cotton, most especially around the rest of the Deep South. in places like Alabama and Mississippi. So these new plantation owners have no intention of picking cotton themselves, and there is no early 19th century model for using white indentured servants to pick cotton or to cultivate sugar. The model, of course, is slavery, plantation slavery, a model that's been refined throughout the 18th century in places like South Carolina and Georgia. So if we're going to cultivate sugar and cotton, and we need large numbers of enslaved people to do that labor for us, where do we get these enslaved laborers from? Now, most southern planters get most of their enslaved labor by purchasing them from slave traders touring the new states of the Deep South and the Cotton Kingdom, who have brought with them caravans, coffles, or ships full of enslaved people who they legally bought from slave owners in the Upper South, in places like Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. And we called this redistribution of enslaved people in the early 19th century the domestic slave trade, or the internal slave trade. And it's massive. By some estimates, 1 million enslaved people are sold, transported, and then bought from the Upper South across the country to the Lower South between 1790 and 1860. 1 million people make this forced migration in the legal domestic slave trade. And demand is so great that completely unscrupulous entrepreneurs see an opportunity to kidnap free black people and pass them off as slaves, to insert them into this legal supply chain, to disguise them in this legal supply chain, and try to sell them either to planters who don't ask the right questions about where these people come from, or more likely planters who don't care about the answers to where these people come from if the price is right. And of course, one last thing, by 1825, we have said goodbye to the legal transatlantic slave trade. Congress and the Jefferson administration outlaw further American participation in the international slave trade from Africa and the Caribbean. So we're dealing with, legally at least, a closed system after 1808. So the two sources of slave labor are either existing slaves or free people who can be passed off as slaves. And those are the macro forces that end up filling this ship with 5 boys over the course of just a few hours, one night in August in 1825.
And you have that sort of like those heart-wrenching descriptions of the people who then are looking for their children, or looking for people who have been stolen, and the sort of newspaper appeals to those. What did it feel like to read those sort of things in the archive? And then as a historian, how do you kind of remain a historian in moments like that? And then also, were the newspaper ads looking for stolen people ever successful in getting them back?
Yeah, so thank you for raising that question. I mean, one of the things I've tried to do in the book is center this story on the experience of the 5 boys, but also to a lesser degree, because the sources are so fragmentary, to try to keep the perspectives of as many of these parents and families from whom children were stolen away in the spotlight for as long as possible. We don't have much in the way of sources from the parents' perspectives, but one thing I did discover in the course of doing the research for this book is the missing persons notice that the parents of one of these 5 boys, whose name is Cornelius, places in one of the Philadelphia newspapers. And while you were talking, I just opened the book and found the ad. And because it's short, I thought I might try and read it just so folks can hear in the voice of one of these parents. The dad's name is Joseph. What it sounds like when you place a missing persons ad for a child of yours who has disappeared and whom you've reluctantly concluded has probably not just forgotten the time and forgot to come home, or is staying over with a friend who hasn't told you, but who's been kidnapped and who you think you might never see again. So this ad comes from Poulson's American Daily Advertiser. It was published in that Philadelphia paper on August the 13th, 1825, under the headline, "Boy Lost." It reads, "The subscriber's son, Cornelius Sinclair, a colored boy, about 11 years old, left his friends yesterday, and as he had no cause and never before presented himself, it is feared he has been seduced away by some evil-minded person. He is a very dark mulatto, pretty stout-built, thin, long fingers, his eyes weak, left eye smaller than the right. Any person hearing of him will confer a favor on his afflicted parents by giving information to Wigan and Whitney, number 19 South Front Street, and all persons are forbid harboring him under penalty of the law. Joseph Sinclair." So, the human dimensions of this story are, I'm sure, obvious to your listeners, but it's easy to forget them when we pan out too quickly to the macro story. If we're only talking about the macro story, about the rise of the domestic slave trade, the closing of the international transatlantic slave trade, the larger phenomenon of the kidnapping of free people into slavery, then we can get abstracted in quantification, in numbers, and forget that behind the numbers there are names and stories and lives and parents who are tearing at themselves, collapsing into themselves psychologically in some cases because their children have disappeared. They don't know where they are, but they suspect the worst.
Yeah, it's I mean, you can really feel the sort of gravity of it, and I think part of the most sort of like challenging thing is that this is only the beginning of sort of this, like you describe it as an Odyssey that is about to begin, this reverse underground railroad. Anyone who's driven down the East Coast or I-95 understands, it takes a long time in a car on paved highway. How brutal was this journey in these caravans?
Yeah, that's right. And so these walking caravans, these sort of walking chain gangs of Black people were very common sights on southern roads between the end of the War of 1812 and the start of the Civil War in 1860. They're often referred to as convoys or caravans or coffles, which is the Arabic word for caravan. And so they broadly resemble the convoys of people captured in West Africa marching to the coasts and the European ships to begin the Middle Passage. But within the United States, this journey, which typically takes people, whether they are legally bought and being transported for resale, or whether they've been illegally kidnapped and trafficked into slavery, typically takes people from the states of the Upper South, like Delaware, like Maryland, like Virginia, down into the depths of the Deep South, again, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. This is a journey of hundreds and hundreds of miles. The routes varied, of course, but you're talking about traversing, 5, 6, 7 different states. You're talking about traversing the Appalachian mountains. You're talking about a journey which at about 15 miles a day, which was the walking pace for most of these enslaved people, who, to be clear, are made to walk, that can take 2 to 3 months. Ed Baptist calculated it was a journey of 2 million steps. Imagine that, one foot in front of the other, 2 million times after 12 weeks. And there are things we know about what that experience were like and things we don't know about what that experience were like. One of the sources for anyone trying to recover the experience of enslaved people making that coffle journey are travelers' accounts, because the 1820s and 30s and 40s were a golden age of European visitors from all across Europe coming to the United States to check it out, this new country. And they did a sort of reverse grand tour. And so there's they're always two volume accounts of this guy's journey through the States over the past 2 years. They're always published in Edinburgh, London, or wherever. And it's almost a set piece to find these people, these European travelers, often relatively wealthy, out on the southern roads, and to be confronted by a cloud of dust coming towards them in the opposite direction, which resembles itself into a slave coffle. which could be 5 people, could be 40 people, could sometimes be hundreds of people if we're talking about the legal domestic slave trade, who shuffle by. And these European observers remark consistently on the air of this convoy. They compare it again and again to a funeral procession. It's like seeing a funeral procession go by. But these are Black Americans trudging southward 15 miles a day, camping out under the stars at night, under the very watchful gaze of captors or coffle captains, depending on your terminology, who are often heavily armed, who are ever vigilant for the possibilities of escape or insurrection or simple lagging, and who carry whips and guns and chains and are not afraid to use them to preserve their own lives and preserve the profitability of their expeditions southward. So I try to use sources like these travel accounts to reconstruct the story of these 5 boys and their journey from the eastern shore of Maryland and the Delaware line, where they're first warehoused after leaving Philadelphia, then across the Chesapeake Bay, through Virginia, through Tennessee, other places, before they arrive in Alabama and Mississippi, where the intention is they will be sold. And beyond the physical descriptions that travelers' accounts are able to offer, you can use the business records of some legal slave traders to illuminate the experience of being in being in a coffle, whether it was legal or illicit. And then we have precious few but useful accounts from people who later escaped slavery and who recounted their experience in one of these forced migrations. Solomon Northup is a good example, though he traveled by ship rather than on foot. But there are occasional accounts of people who escaped this reverse Underground Railroad, and many more accounts of legally traded slaves who later gained their freedom and wrote about it. And so if you put enough of these sources together, we sort of triangulate and corroborate them to find where the truth lies. The goal of these central 2 chapters in my book, Stolen, is to understand the physical experiences the boys went through over this long 2 million step journey, but also try to recover as much as I can about the psychological dimensions of that journey. Remember, these boys, Sam and Joe are both about 15 years old. Enos and Cornelius are 10 years old, and Alex is 8 years old. I mean, what must that experience have been like? I want readers to grapple with those questions as they think about the boys' journey into the Deep South as slaves.
And I mean, it's daunting. And when you put those numbers to it, I mean, it becomes even more just extraordinary, taking these 2 million steps, you know, being hungry and beaten and these kind of things, not having your family, you know, the just sort of psychological torment there. You mentioned a little bit, and we seem to have a lot of it on the descriptions of the middle passage with people who ran slave ships and things like this, right? The accounts. Are these people similar to those sort of ship captains? Is it mostly males? Are there transporting female free and enslaved blacks as well? Is there sexual violence? It doesn't just stop at the mental torment, right?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And while my book centers on 5 boys, there are also 2 adult women who make this journey alongside them, who are a key part of this story. So the particular coffle drags 7 people from the Upper South towards the Deep South. 5 of them, the boys I've mentioned, and these 2 adult women as well.
And so,
let me just finish out that thought there as I turn off my So the threat of sexual violence on this forced migration was ever present, and thanks to the work of Ed Baptist and Tom Foster and several others, we're starting to better appreciate just how omnipresent the threat of sexual violence was in every aspect of this domestic slave trade. We have the strong suggestion that one of the two women in this story was sexually assaulted by one of her captors early in this journey, or at least she behaves very strangely later in this story, and the best explanation to explain her behavior is to impute an act of sexual assault on part of this journey. So yes, there are women, there are girls who are kidnapped into slavery, though again children and particularly young boys seem to be the most common victims of this reverse Underground Railroad, while most of the captors were of course men traveling either alone or with other men. We know that on this particular journey it was a husband and wife team who were the captors who shepherded these 5 boys and 2 adult women across the country. Their names were Ebenezer and Sally Johnson, and they had only been married about a year, maybe less. So in some really sick way, this was their honeymoon. This was their honeymoon from hell. And one can only imagine what it is like to be starting out your life with someone and to watch that someone whip another human being 50 times, which is something Ebenezer does to Sam at one point in the story.
And so eventually these people in these coffles are either sold into slavery, or they have to find a way to escape. You can't really escape a coffle because you're kind of chained up. You don't know anyone. You don't have any food, any shelter. How does this escape or Odyssey work out?
So I don't want to say too much about how the Odyssey works out, though readers of who know the book will know that the book, its subtitle reads, 5 free boys kidnapped into slavery and their astonishing Odyssey home. So there's obviously a clue there that something happens. But what I will say first of all is that most kidnapped people, whether they be adults or children, who are forced to ride this reverse Underground Railroad, they are never heard from again. They do not make an astonishing Odyssey home. And that's not for lack of trying or any lack of courage on their part. It's because of the system built to transport them into slavery, to turn free people into slaves, was stunningly effective. And that when there are planters in the Deep South incurious or unwilling to listen to the pleas of people they have bought who say they are actually kidnapped free people. And the distances involved to get back home, and the lack of any local allies in unfamiliar territory in Tennessee, in Georgia, in Louisiana, wherever we end up, wherever this story takes place, it's not surprising to learn that many legally free black people were kidnapped into slavery and never heard from again. The most famous case, of course, is Solomon Northup. What is the title of his memoir? It is 12 Years a Slave. This adult man who is literate and has lots of friends in high places when he is kidnapped, it takes him 12 years to extricate himself from the reverse Underground Railroad. So now imagine the odds stacked against 8-year-old Alex Manlove, 10-year-old Enos Tillman, 10-year-old Cornelius Sinclair. The fact that a series of events occur in their particular story, which allow several but not all of these boys to eventually return to Philadelphia, is highly unusual. And that's one of the things that drew me to this particular story. And it's also one of the things that made the telling of this story possible. The fact that some of these boys did make an astonishing Odyssey home produced a body of records about their experience, which are not normally produced when people do not make an astonishing Odyssey home. So that body of records allowed me to tell this story and get this word out about the larger phenomenon of what I'm calling the reverse Underground Railroad.
Yeah, and one of the sort of like gripping phrases you use is the capillaries of a domestic middle passage. Do you hope that this book will sort of bring those alive more for historians? I'm not saying historians have neglected it in the past, but certainly it seems with the United States we like to compartmentalize and say this happened in this state and this state was different, you know? Uh, do you sort of see this as a new take on that?
So yes and no, obviously, right? The domestic slave trade, the legal selling, transport, and then purchasing of southern slaves, this grand redistribution of 1 million people, has been well known within the academy for a while. There are great books about it by Steve Dial, by Ed Baptist, by Walter Johnson's amazing book, Soul by Soul, which I'd recommend to anyone listening. The phenomenon of the reverse Underground Railroad, the kidnapping of free people into slavery, did get a spotlight shone on it belatedly by the runaway success of the 12 Years a Slave movie, which came out, I think, in 2013 and won the Best Picture Oscar, and well-deserved because it's an amazing piece of cinema, which everyone should see. But the phenomenon of child trafficking, which it turns out is way more common than the phenomenon of adult kidnapping and human trafficking that happened to Northup, hasn't got much exposure, perhaps even within the academy and certainly without it. So I made a conscious decision here to not just write a book about the reverse Underground Railroad and the phenomenon of child trafficking, but to focus it on a particular experience and a particular small cast of characters, a particular case, really. These 5 boys, Sam, Enos, Alex, Joe, and Cornelius, and what happened to them, because human beings are hardwired to respond to narrative, to stories. I know I certainly am. I know this is what grabbed me about this story, was that I could follow 5 individuals through an Odyssey, and that I was deeply invested in their journey through this hellscape and to some extent out the other side. And so I hope that readers respond to these individuals the way I did. And I'll just say one further thing, and I write about this briefly in the acknowledgements in my book. When I came across the story, when it started to grip me and hold me, my wife and I were trying to get pregnant. We subsequently have 2 happy, healthy young children. And the thought that anyone could ever take my kids from me and I'd never see them again, sort of, it tore at me in some really primal way. And it was very easy to put myself in the place of the parents in this story who are separated from their children, who are kidnapped and sold away. To me, there was something sort of universal about this history story, which seemed pretty relevant also to the way we live now and the crisis at our border this year.
Yeah, and so I mean, you've kind of led me there, and I was hoping the conversation would get to this point. As someone who works on the 19th century, and you mentioned this is a story that's in 1825. It's almost, historians are almost always pulled to the present in some way for conversations that are happening now. How has the reception been, and how do you sort of parse that out as a historian who's studying the 19th century and having to answer questions coming from present day?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to use this platform to make any pronouncements about where we stand politically in these United States in 2019. I don't think that's my place, but I do hope that readers will find resonances and echoes and maybe even inspiration from the characters in this true story who battled problems which are not dissimilar from families facing separation via ice, via coyotes at the southern border, families who think that asylum is promised to them and secure, or that having the right documents guarantees freedom. I think what we learned from this story about the 1820s is that northern black families living in northern states where slavery was dead or dying, who were legally free, found to their great horror and shock that their freedom remained extremely fragile And so I would argue that, freedoms have to be defended and protected. And there has been no bright line in American history between slavery and the freedom of vulnerable, marginalized people, in this case, free Black African Americans, has been fragile in the period before the Civil War. And that fragility of the freedom of marginalized people is not an historical phenomenon. It's a trans-historical phenomenon, which I think we can see playing out perhaps with different demographics in the world we live now.
That's absolutely, relevant and topical, and people. This sort of connection to family separation is something that's never going to go away. Do you find you've given so many good examples throughout of other literature that the Academy has put out? About sort of whatever Solomon Northup or if it's Walter Johnson's book, do you find in your personal experience that it's taking hold with people you talk to? How do your students receive this? How do people you chat with outside of the Academy receive it?
That's a hard one to answer. Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely following in the tradition of a wealth of narrative-driven, individualized stories. We often call them micro-histories, which have found ways to tell complicated, important truths about American history through the vehicle of narrative and character, and often the lives of unheralded people. I teach a graduate course on how to write microhistory, which has long been an excuse for me to go read a whole bunch of microhistory, and I'm happy to recommend some good examples of the genre by way of a closing suggestion. But I will say, yes, I think those of us who teach for a living, we see every day that when we get up and stand up and speak about complex macro forces and institutions like slavery, for instance, or racism, then our excellent students, our well-meaning students, can sometimes glaze over when confronted with scale, with the numbers, with the dimensions, with the reach of a problem like slavery. But they tend to lean forward and lean in and ask questions and demonstrate curiosity when you tell stories about individuals affected by or complicit in any aspect of this. So I've tried to notice that fact and respond to it, not just in my writing, but in my teaching. I'm teaching a big course here at the University of Maryland this semester called Fighting Slavery, and it's aimed at non-history majors. It's aimed at people taking a general education requirement. So my typical student is a freshman engineer or a sophomore biologist who has to be there because he or she needs 3 credits in history to move forward. And one of the pedagogical challenges is holding those students' attention and making them feel like they're learning something of great value. And so narrative and individual experience has been my go-to tactic every time. So when I teach Jamaican plantation slavery in the 18th century, I do it through the diary of Thomas Thistlewood, who was an 18th century plantation owner and overseer who documented in the most skin-crawling detail you will ever read the physical violence he inflicted upon the human property in his custody, and the sexual violence he inflicted against a string of women, including one woman he had sex with over 4,000 times. And I try to tell her story alongside his as a way to illuminate larger themes in the master-slave relationship as it plays out in the Caribbean, as it plays out in the plantation setting, most especially. And to do things like that every week with different topics. I haven't yet found a way to work these protagonists in my book into my undergraduate teaching yet, but they're part and parcel of a larger attempt, copying the best practices of many other scholars to humanize the history of slavery and abolition in the hope that students will realize what was at stake, what was accomplished, against what odds, and by whom, and to realize that the fight against slavery in America was so much more than the scratch of a pen by Abraham Lincoln on the Emancipation Proclamation of the Civil War era, that it was a result of decades, centuries of struggle by a broad cast of characters, and the enslaved people themselves led the way in the fight against slavery at every step.
And one thing that these people, I study Quakers myself, so I get a lot of this kind of interesting movement starting against things that are perceived wrongs, and rightly so, by the Quakers organizing and so on. And that's in your book as well. I think people will find that fascinating. But one thing that seems to always pop up when I talk about slavery or any history that's not, seemingly within the past 10 years, is people say, well, that was then, and that was bad, and it's terrible, but what does this have to do with me? Have you got that reaction?
I don't think any of my students have been brave enough to say that to my face. I'm thinking it. Maybe they will save that for the course evaluations. I don't know. And now that the book is out, now Stolen is out, we're always told not to read our reviews. So who knows what Amazon customer reviews will have to say about this book. But, this book is committed to the idea that ordinary people make history, that the decisions these 5 boys made, which represent the types of resistance and opposition to slavery made by a great many other enslaved people and their white allies, including the Quakers, as you rightly mention, that they add up, and that the arc of the universe is being bent by the actions of this 8-year-old child, these 10-year-old children, these 15-year-old children, their parents, their Quaker allies in Philadelphia, and other people. So that all adds up to the idea that ordinary people who are not presidents, who are not generals in battle, have the capacity to make transformative change in the world. I deeply believe that, and I'm committed to it politically as well. And I've yet to meet a human being who cannot be persuaded to the idea that every individual has the capacity, to a greater or lesser extent, to move the needle, to shake the world.
What a great message. And throughout, you've given us excellent suggestions. We are going to link to your book on the Hour of History website, and I know everyone's going to check it out after hearing just some of these snippets. There's much more detail and I mean, just vivid retelling of this fascinating story, and I highly encourage everyone to pick up Stolen. But this is the time of the show where we give an additional suggestion. So in addition to all the great works that you've already suggested in your own work, what would you suggest people check out?
Yeah, so I love this question, though it's actually hard to answer because there are so many good choices. So I teach a big course on microhistory, as I mentioned, and so I've had the opportunity to read dozens of these types of histories, and I've now written my own. So picking out just a couple to mention seems like a fool's errand, but I will do it anyway. One not very well known, the least well known of 3 books I'm going to name, which has nothing to do with slavery, by the way, but is about American history, is by the Australian historian Donna Merrick, which is Merwick. It's called Death of a Notary, Conquest and Change in Colonial New York. And it's about a Dutch settler in New Amsterdam who commits suicide at exactly the point where the Dutch are handing over control of that colony to the English in the 17th century. And Merrick, who is a brilliant writer and incredibly smart scholar, uses his suicide as an opportunity to illuminate the period of very difficult, chaotic transformation from being a Dutch colony to an English colony. The guy's life was ruined by the transition, and he decided to commit suicide as a result. The second book is a book I teach with any opportunity I get. It's another micro-history about American history. It's by Paul Johnson and Sean Wilentz, and it's called The Kingdom of Matthias, a story of sex and salvation in 19th century America. And it's about one of America's first cult leaders, a guy who believes he is a prophet, who changes his name to Matthias the prophet and tries to start a new church, a new faith, not in Western New York or or in Utah or anywhere else you might imagine other cult leaders of the day tried to set up their own faiths, but in downtown Manhattan. He grows a beard and starts a church in downtown Manhattan and hopes that that will initiate the kingdom, what he calls the kingdom. And things go horribly wrong for him and for the people around him. And this little singular strange story about this guy growing the beard and telling everyone he's a prophet illuminates grand themes in the Second Great Awakening, the rise of the benevolent empire, and also sheds light on the foundation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as well. So I'd recommend that one, The Kingdom of Matthias. Also, it's full of sex, which my students really like. And then lastly, a book which is not full of sex, but my students also really like, is by my colleague at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. His name's Adam Rothman, and the book is called Beyond Freedom's Reach, a kidnapping in the twilight of slavery. So this is another micro-history about a kidnapping. This one takes place in towards the end of the Civil War, where an enslaved person in Louisiana, as slavery is crumbling rapidly in the carnage of Civil War, is kidnapped, and her child is involved too, by slave owners who try to smuggle this mother and daughter out of the United States and to Cuba, where they can preserve their rights as property holders. And Adam Rothman follows this transnational story in the midst of Civil War, in the midst of the crumbling of slavery, across Louisiana and into Cuba and back. And there are more twists and turns than I care to name. And it reads and teaches like a dream. So Adam Rothman, Beyond Freedom's Reach, is the third of what could be an infinite list of excellent recent micro histories. In fact, if any audience members out there ever want to contact me, I can send them a bibliography of dozens of these things if they want to read more.
It's absolutely fantastic, and that's why we have this section, and that's why I always love having historians on, is because historians have these endless lists of books and just excellent works, and there's so many out there that you can always find. I'm not going to suggest a book, though. I'm going to change it up a little bit because you have so much great material to read already from listening to this. But what I am going to suggest is engaging with public history sites around you, especially if you're on the East Coast of the United States. I know not everyone has public history sites relevant to this book, but I remember visiting in Charleston the old Slave Mart Museum that showed where some of these people were auctioned off after such journeys from the illegal slave market to the legal slave market. And just to sort of stand in these places, think about them and engage with them is kind of an extraordinary addition you can do to your practice of history, to reading history, even if it's outside of what you normally think about. So I encourage you to read books like Stolen itself too, and look at some of these locations. And next time, you're in Philadelphia at the Navy Yard, think about it. And I think that's just a powerful, moving exercise, just like reading these works. So that's my suggestion. I want to thank you, Rick, so much for joining us and so much for writing this fantastic book. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, thank you for this honor. And just in addition to this public history sites list you already gave out, I'd add the Whitney Plantation just outside of New Orleans, a historic site now being turned into a living history site, which handles the history of plantation slavery far better than many other historic plantation sites in the Deep South. The Whitney Plantation, there are all sorts of newspaper stories about it you can read to figure out what makes it so different and distinctive, and I hope some of your readers check it out.
Yeah, thank you so much. A fantastic suggestion, and something that I'm glad to hear that the South is kind of working on, because those plantations, that's been an issue with their presentation of public history in the past. Thank you so much, Rick, and everyone go check out the book Stolen.
Thanks for your time, Stephen. I appreciate it.
All right, on Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, anyplace. So long.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.